Everybody to today's Meet the Faculty speaker series, our first for the 2021-2022 school year. My name is Serene Saade. I'm Prescott College faculty, associate faculty, and I'm really grateful and honored to be moderating today's event. I want to acknowledge the fact that I am on unceded Mdewakanton Sioux land, and I work on unceded Dakota land here in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. I also want to honor my grandfathers, who I would not be a Prescott College alumni or student or faculty without them. They knew I was going to be a teacher long before I ever wanted to be a teacher. I want to introduce Dr. Anita Fernández, who I had the great pleasure of working with and for many years now. Another person I wouldn't be teaching at Prescott College but for. Dr. Fernández is the Prescott College Chief Diversity Officer, the former director of the Social Justice and Community Organizing Program, director of the Tucson Center, and somebody I just greatly admire as a community organizer and a community leader. Today, Dr. Fernández is going to be talking about the attacks on critical race theory, decolonial ethnic studies, and Arab American studies. Building solidarity across movements is a core tenet of that work and has been central to the work of the Xicanx Institute for Teaching and Organizing, XITO, which is an urban education consulting collective. Dr. Fernández runs XITO, and she's going to be using something called a Trenza Testimonio to weave together the collective work that she's been engaged in with XITO around critical race theory, decolonial ethnic studies, and Arab American studies. I'm really excited for today's talk. I'm going to leave the rest of today's introduction to Dr. Fernández, but I want to thank you all for being here. Just one quick piece of housekeeping. This first hour is going to be in a webinar format. It will be recorded, and then after Dr. Fernández's presentation is complete, we'll move into Q&A. As your questions come up, please send them to me directly via the chat or via DM. I'm writing them down, and then we'll get through, whatever questions we can get through in the half an hour we have after the presentation. Thank you all for being here. Feel free to reach out to me directly. And then Carla from marketing is under the welcome if you have any technical issues. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fernández.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then I will go ahead and get started. All right. Can you all see that? Almost. Good? Serene? Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that beautiful introduction, Dr. Saad, and I'm really honored to have you as my moderator today. As Serene said, my name is Anita, and I use ella, she, her pronouns. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer here in Tucson. I am based here on the unceded lands of the O'odham, and right now I'm in our K-20 Changemaker campus space. So you may hear adolescent voices running around at the end of the school day. But I'm really honored to be here and to be the first speaker for this series. And thank you to Faculty Leadership Council for the invitation. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. I'm really excited to share some of the work that I've been engaged in, specifically with the collective I work with, the Xicanx Institute for Teaching and Organizing, but also with my students and with other organizers and educators across the country. And so I've titled this talk, Indigenous Solidarity, Climate Justice, and Decolonial Ethnic Studies, Trenza Testimonio. And so I want to highlight these three specific areas and their interconnectedness in the work that we do. And so I'm framing this as a trenza testimonio. And a trenza in Spanish is a braid, as most of you probably know. And a testimonio is like a personal story. And so I'm using a testimonial approach intentionally rather than like a traditional academic presentation, because I, as Chicana feminist theorists pose, drawing on Chicana feminist epistemology and anti-colonial praxis, a trenza epistemology really explores this power and voice, and particularly the silence in white spaces for Chicanas and Latinas. And so Trenza Testimonio is a form of resistance to dominant forms of academic writing, and in this case, academic presenting. And so the metaphor of using the trenza is, that a trenza or a braid is a traditional hairstyle for Indigenous people and for all genders. And historically, colonizers have used that as a way to, when wanting to forcefully assimilate Indigenous peoples, they've removed the trenzas, right? The cut hair from Indigenous people to force them to assimilate. And that's cutting off, not only a symbol of your cultura, but also, a really powerful symbol about, the interconnected, woven nature of who you are. And so my intention in this talk is to weave together specifically our collective movement work that's held together through this big concept of solidarity. And so what I want to do is start off with a historical context. Those of you who have been in the professional development that I've been doing with the faculty, I keep talking about historical literacy. We need to be historically literate. And this talk is no different, right? We have to understand the historical context before I can share the work so that you understand where it's situated. Because organizing and education is always situated in a historical context. And so I'm going to start off a little self-promoting, right? I'm going to talk about back in 2012. So it's a while ago now, 9 years ago, Dr. Zoe Hammer and I published an article titled The Red Scare in the Red State, right? The Attack on Mexican-American Studies in Arizona and Opportunities for Building National Solidarity. And in that article, at the very end of the article, we stated that the stakes are high and risk-filled when building power to counter the neoliberal agenda. And yet we cannot stand by and allow our educational system, and most importantly, our children, be the pawns of a political fight to erase the histories of oppressed groups and to eliminate programs that clearly offer success and empowerment to Latinx students. A national call for solidarity to address these issues is an immediate necessity, as well as a direct obligation of those of us in the social justice field. And so the work I'm going to share with you is sort of in response to our own writing, right? To our own call to action, and really framing the work that we do as an obligation, right? As a responsibility that we have to our communities when we are fighting back against what in 2012 was the banning of ethnic studies here in Arizona, specifically Mexican-American studies. And what today, it has the same tone and the same flavor, but it's being framed just a little bit differently. So in 2012, also, after the banning of the Mexican-American Studies program in Tucson, we there was a Sunday class, the Chicano Literature and Social Studies class that was held on the south side of Tucson in a community center. And it was started out as a Latino literature course taught by Curtis Acosta. And I worked with Curtis and helped to create a mechanism for Prescott College to actually award college credit for those courses. And a lot of people don't know that history, how Prescott College was connected to that banning of ethnic studies and then continuing on that legacy afterwards. So in 2013, after class, we decided we can't continue to do this on Sundays forever. How do we continue on the legacy of what was a program that was outlawed, but literally flipped the quote unquote achievement gap, right? It sent students to college at a higher rate, their test scores were higher, they matriculated to college at a much higher rate, that the numbers were completely flipped. And specifically the numbers for Xicanx Latinx youth. And so we formed XITO as a collective to continue on that legacy by training educators, organizers, school counselors, administrators across the country. And to date, we've trained thousands of those folks. And that's some of the work that I'll share with you. So to contextualize it also, even though those class courses were high school courses for college credit, there was also a Tucson semester happening. And so we had groups of Prescott College students coming to Tucson. They were very involved in the movement to save ethnic studies. And they were learning all of the curriculum that the band classes had learned. And I had Sean Arce, who was the co-founder and director of the Mexican American Studies program, came and worked with me and taught those classes. And so he worked for Prescott College as well. And so, so Latino Fox News got a hold of that story. And so I just want to share a clip to again contextualize what was happening in 2013 in relation to Prescott College and this program.
2 years ago, the state of Arizona found the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson to be anti-American and banned it from their public schools. But today, the classes are back in the form of a college credit course. Anita Fernández and Sean Arce reintroduced the classes to Prescott College in Tucson earlier this year.
There's a very successful program that has had a high graduation rate, a high rate of sending students to college, a high test score rate.
The decision to offer the classes for college credit came after years of fighting to bring them back to the school district. That fight ended in March when Circuit Judge Wallace Tashima declared that the ban on ethnic studies is in fact constitutional. Arizona Attorney General Tom Horne pushed to have the program banned in 2010, citing the curriculum promoted anti-American beliefs and created a division between Mexican American students and their peers.
I believe that the political powers that be want to maintain unequal economic, political, cultural power relationships. So this is one way to cease the progress of the community.
Horne issued a statement saying the cancellation of the program was necessary in order to ensure that public education is not held captive to radical political elements and that students treat each other as individuals, not on the basis of the race they were born into. Though the highly debated classes won't be returning to Tucson's public schools anytime soon, you might see them popping up in a high school near you.
And we actually have people contacting us all the time and saying, you know, my school district's really interested in this successful program. Would you come and train our teachers?
Both sides may not see eye to eye on the controversy, but one thing is for certain. This issue is far from resolved. In Tucson, Aliyah Shahid, Fox News Latino.
Okay, so just a little bit of contextual history. That was Tom Horne, who actually helped to write the legislation that banned the Mexican American Studies program. He was the superintendent of instruction and then became Arizona's attorney general. I literally posted an article today that he is running for attorney general again in Arizona. And today he's up in the Prescott area doing a talk on critical race theory. So you can see how, you know, it's the same themes over and over with a lot of these folks. So this is Curtis Acosta teaching the Sunday Chicano literature class. And these are some of his high school students from Tucson High School that would show up on Sundays to continue their education because it had been banned, right? They couldn't learn any more of the history and culture and literature of their own ancestors, of their own communities. And so as we gave, you know, awarded credit for these courses, we started to get a lot of press and a lot of attention. And so here's just one example in the nation. You know, Prescott School grants credits to outlawed MAS course in Tucson, welcome to Freedom College, right? And that just started to snowball. And we started to get a lot of media coverage, and that XITO just took off, and we were able to really build what has become a national platform for ethnic studies. Our, Our organization started off very small. And so our first training started off with 9 participants. I think 6 of those were just friends who, you know, came because they kind of felt bad. And then we had like 3 participants who actually flew in and paid a fee and actually attended our first institute. And then we slowly started to grow. And we, at one point, you know, we were running out of space. Our first institute was in the old Tucson Center on Speedway, which is a very small classroom. And so then we had a videographer offer to write, you know, or develop a quick PSA of what XITO is that I want to share with you. And you can see, you know, how folks are all crowded into this basement. This is actually the basement of the Paulo Freire School here in Tucson. And we would just, folks that we knew in the community would loan us space to do 3 days of intense professional development with educators and organizers who would come from across the country. So here's just another quick video about, this is right around 2014 and what our work is about. Oops.
We have a problem in education that's we're not reaching our youth.
My name is Anita, and I am here as the director of XITO, Xicanx Institute for Teaching and Organizing. And the purpose for this institute is to bring together activists and organizers and educators from across the country to learn about the former Mexican American Studies program and the pedagogy and the Indigenous epistemology so that they can take it back to their communities and embed it into the work that they're doing there.
I would say the mission, as I see it, and what drives our work is centered around education and providing the students that we interact with the opportunity to meet their full potential as human beings.
That's my passion, is to get them to find a place here in society where they feel like they're a part of it, they're contributing to society in a positive way, and they matter.
We have a demographic shift that's taking place in this country, particularly in the Southwest, that we have a really fast increasing raza Chicano student population, yet we're being pushed out of school at very high rates.
Okay, so that was about 2014. And then throughout the building of XITO, as we grew and as we continued to work across the country, we were fighting this legal battle at the same time. It was a 7-year legal battle. And I just wanted to highlight that too, because I think it's really important to remember, particularly as we're in this political moment right now, where there are going to continue to be legal battles for the K-12 schools. And our battle went all the way to the Ninth Circuit. And so this is a picture of us outside the Ninth Circuit court before hearing oral arguments. And so we opened in ceremony, right? Even though this is sort of a colonial structure, legal structure here, we opened in traditional Mexica ceremony at sunrise. And you can see Sean Arce there in the middle, and his daughter over here on the right, Maya Arce, who I'll talk about in just a minute, who's one of the plaintiffs. I'm in the back here with my daughter, and there are all these folks that you see around here are folks that have been with us throughout the movement and have built their own, many of them, their own structures to counter some of the fights on ethnic studies that have happened. So after the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, was actually bumped back to the federal court here in Tucson. And so there was actually a trial in Tucson. And that our colegas, including Sean, who's here on the stand, we couldn't take pictures. So this is a artist rendition. And that's his daughter on the left, Maya Arce, who is the plaintiff in this ended up being Maya Arce versus the state of Arizona and one of the attorneys. And the final finding, after putting Chicano history on trial, after putting Chicano studies on trial, and our friends and colleagues and family having to get up there and literally defend the right to teach about that, the court concluded that this whole law was motivated by racial animus, right? And that the defendants, one of them who was Tom Horn, enacted and enforced for illicit reasons rather than out of pedagogical concern. And so this is a really, really important finding. It sets a legal precedent now for all of the lawsuits that are going to come, that are coming up right now, and that we're going to be facing in this new fight against, critical ethnic studies, decolonial ethnic studies, as well as critical race theory. And so this finding has already been used in the former administration. The Trump administration tried to instate the Muslim ban. This was one of the cases that was used to set a precedent, and also in supporting DACA students, it has been used as well. So we've grown tremendously. This is a recent article about XITO, Generation HB 2281, which was the law, how the banning of ethnic studies led to a national uprising. And so out of something really horrible and painful and violent, educational violence in a lot of ways, sprung up a national uprising for ethnic studies to spread across the country, particularly in the West. And for now, there to be actual requirements for high school, many districts and states requiring ethnic studies as a result of what happened here in Tucson. And so this is a picture of the last summer institute that we had in person a couple of years ago. This is at City High School downtown in Tucson. And a lot of the folks in this picture also are part of that larger family group. We have a lot of Changemaker High School folks here, and journalists and educators, folks from Napa Valley that have been longtime supporters. And so these are the people that have continued to build this movement forward. So going back to the timeline, before jumping into our work. So in 2017, the law is overturned, and after a 7-year legal battle. And I wanted to share this picture on the right. This is Maya Arce on the right, who was the plaintiff in the Arce versus State of Arizona case. She was 15 when she was the plaintiff. And on the left is Sylvia Mendez. And Sylvia Mendez was the plaintiff when she was 8 years old, in the Mendez versus Westminster case. It's a very important educational case that actually paved the way for ending segregation in California schools. And she was a defendant because at 8 years old, she was not allowed to attend what was at that time called a white school. And so Maya and Sylvia were both plaintiffs in these critically important movements and legal battles, and they got to meet a couple of years ago. And so I think this is just a really beautiful reminder of the resilience and the resistance and the power, of these Chicanas, these Latinas. And oftentimes we talk about the cycles of oppression that repeat themselves over and over in the cycle that we're in now, but we also need to remember the cycle of cultural resilience, right? And this is a really beautiful example of that. So in 2018, this is important to note, California was looking at requiring ethnic studies at the high school level. And so the California Instructional Quality Commission selected 18 ethnic studies scholars to develop the curriculum for their statewide ethnic studies. Many of those folks are the people that I keep referring to, right, that have been doing this work for a very long time. They developed a very powerful ethnic studies high school curriculum. And so right after that, we had summer of 2020, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were killed, and there was a reigniting and really a call for ending police brutality, and for schools, a real push to address white supremacy, social justice, the experience of BIPOC communities, and everyone was scrambling to, add this to their curriculum in summer of 2020. So the response, in part, in summer of 2021, was that the California Ethnic Studies curriculum came under attack. And the curriculum task force is reassembled, and a watered down version of the curriculum has been submitted. And the main attack on the original curriculum was an attack against the inclusion of Arab American studies, and specifically any mention of Palestine. And so there were very powerful forces that critiqued, or still critiquing, the original curriculum, and that had a hand in actually having this curriculum eliminated and a new curriculum written. So we're seeing those same patterns over and over, right? And this is not just an attack on ethnic studies, it's also an attack on, critical race theory, Black Lives Matters. It's a coordinated attack, and it's to literally criminalize a curriculum to the point that, just like in Tucson, criminalizing the mention of Palestine when this curriculum is taught. Even the California Department of Education took issue with having a mention in the curriculum about Rashida Tlaib, the Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. And so this has gotten a lot of attention, and it's really important to contextualize this within the work that I'm about to share. So then the attacks on critical race theory in K-12 schools right now are causing board members to resign, school districts to become overwhelmed with freedom of information requests, and teachers head into fall 2021 with a lot of trepidation about how to teach accurate history in this moment when they are being surveilled and there's literally families wanting to shut down schools and school boards. So that's the general timeline. And so I want to share some of the work that we've done as XITO, and specifically in our solidarity with Palestine and Arab American studies. We developed a series of workshops due to a grant that we received from the Sparkplug Foundation. We were granted $10,000 to collaborate with Teach Palestine to support K-12 teachers to develop curriculum, specifically to explore connections between Palestine and the US-Mexico border region. And the goal is to raise awareness, right? And to teach students to think critically about militarized border zones and the impact that has on youth, families, and particularly on the environment. So we decided to take it a step further and not just look at the environment, but specifically how settler colonialism has an environmental impact in these two regions and beyond. And so all of the workshops that we developed, they ended up obviously having to be virtual because of the pandemic. We had experts come in that were Palestinian educators. We had Palestinian organizers, Jewish educators, folks from XITO, folks from Liberated Ethnic Studies who helped to develop that original California curriculum. We had an ODAM organizer and educator. And all of our workshops were steeped in anchoring our realities in the settler colonial framework. So, comparing things like the Trail of Tears here on this continent and Nakba, right, in Palestine, and looking at the long history of dispossession, expulsion, ethnic cleansing, and how tactics continue, and this history continues in different ways. So our guiding question for all of our trainings was, what are the environmental impacts of settler colonialism on the US, Mexico, and Palestinian borders? And we went over a series of workshops with hundreds of educators, I would say, in total. And they came up with curriculum that they developed based on these topics. So some of them engaged in settler colonialism, gentrification and dispossession, displacement, criminalization of youth, COVID, environmental justice, culture as resistance, and then a comparison between Manifest Destiny and the Promised Land. And so as we continued, building in solidarity with Arab American studies, we really started to recognize, the importance of land and environment at the center of this fight for self-determination, and really wanted to have a focus not only on this content, but also on Indigenous solidarity. And so one of our speakers, Amy Juan, who is from this area, she is an ODAM organizer and educator, and she presented to us on the intersections of Indigenous solidarity, climate justice, settler colonialism, border militarization. And this slide is from her presentation, and she opened it up with this picture of folks from the ODAM Nation on both sides of the US-Mexico border, right? And so folks on the left are in what is referred to as Mexico, and folks on the right are here in what's referred to as the US. And she talked about how, ODAM people are still here. We are very much moving forward, and we're fighting this militarization that's happening on our land. As she says, our land, their borders. And you can see the wall that is there more like a fence. Now what is there is a huge wall that was put up by the Trump administration that I'll be showing you in just a minute. And so in thinking about land and how this ties to the work we were doing in these workshops, Nick Estes, who's an Indigenous studies scholar, he talks about settler colonialism as not only being about taking land, but specifically it's about destroying it, right? It's about colonizers reinventing what a piece of land or a swath of land even looks like, what it can be used for, and when it can't be used for. And so I'm going to share some of Amy's slides, but I also want to share a couple slides from our colegas in Palestine. Here's a picture of a Palestinian woman, trying to save one of the last olive trees from the olive grove that has been passed down for many generations in her family. And you can see the Israeli army or soldiers in the background. They're going through and destroying the olive groves, right? They're taking away all of the cultural history of this land. And this woman is wanting to hang on and save the last piece of her own family history and cultural identity. So settler colonialism is not only about taking land, but also destroying it. And so when we come back here to Organ Pipe National Monument, we see when the wall a couple of years ago was being built by the Trump administration, right through this national monument, but more importantly, right through Odam land, right? And through sacred ancestral land, and devastating the landscape, uprooting 100-year-old saguaros. In Odam culture, saguaros are ancestors, and so literally uprooting ancestors and having a cultural impact, an environmental impact, and just for the sake of border militarization. And important to note that a lot of this border militarization, these walls are put up specifically to keep out climate refugees coming from the global south. And so when we hear about the previous administration, people say, oh, they don't believe in climate change. They don't believe there's a crisis. There are millions of dollars poured into homeland security to actually research what the impacts of climate change are, how many people are going to be forced to leave their communities in the South because of climate change, they're going to be pushed up to the north. So that's a lot of why this is happening as well. Amy also shared, Quito Springs, that is a sacred site and has been around, a spring in the middle of the desert right near where the wall was being built, has been there for thousands of years with water. And it's life not only for animals, but also for people, and includes 2 endangered species. And so this is Quito Springs in January of 2020. And this is Quito Springs 6 months later after the wall construction started. Okay, so completely drying up after thousands of years, while the border construction is happening right next door to this, or right adjacent to this, and there are thousands of gallons of water being mixed into the cement that is needed to construct the border wall. And so, again, it's one of, when we go back to Nick Estie's statement that settler colonialism is also about destroying the land, right? This completely destroys the Odam land, as Amy was presenting it to us. And so in thinking about, land and settler colonialism and the land back movement, really critical to recognize that part of decolonizing work is recognizing that land back isn't just in Turtle Island, right? There's this global normalization of occupation, and we have to be aware about global impact of these occupations. And in Palestine, it's the land, but it's also the homes. And so Ziad, who's one of our presenters and works for the Palestine Project, talked about as Palestinian refugees, we breathe this right, the right to return to our homes. And Palestinians keep the keys from their homes and pass them down from generation to generation with, breathing that right to eventually return to their homes that have been taken from them. And so you can see the graffiti on this wall, or the art on this wall that says, we want to return to our homeland. So that these are, different strands of the trenza, we would say, right, that are really important for us to understand as we work to decolonize ethnic studies, specifically in our case. And so another part of the trenza, or the strands, is decolonial ethnic studies solidarity. And so how do we take all of this content and then ensure that it's not just a multicultural curriculum, but it's truly a decolonial ethnic studies curriculum? And that takes a lot of solidarity across movements. And it also takes an analysis through a critical literacy lens, an analysis of the impacts of settler colonialism, that's essential in a decolonizing ethnic studies curriculum, that you have to, your students have to, and you have to understand that in order to really do this work. And so on the right is a text that many of us published in. I think all of XITO's, our whole collective, each one of us has a chapter in there. Many of the folks that wrote the Liberated Ethnic Studies curriculum, the original California curriculum, many of the organizers that I mentioned, they are all represented in here. So this is a really hands-on lesson plans, very applicable to teaching resource if anybody's interested in that. So I want to share with you just a few of the frameworks of decolonial ethnic studies that we've come up with, and how they inform one another and how we work together by using these different frameworks. And so the first one is our XITO's framework, Tiawi, that the faculty are here. I've shared this with you all. And Tiawi is a Nahuatl word for moving forward. And so it's a decolonial framework for pedagogy and praxis that has 6 tenets around the outside that we believe need to be included in any framework for decolonizing pedagogy and praxis. And so teaching critical consciousness, interconnectedness through student-centered instruction, agency through critical praxis, intersectional identity development, unity through community, and historical literacy. And so in the middle, in the red, is the Nahuatl. And so that is the indigenous epistemology that we use, that was used in the Mexican American Studies program, that has been operationalized. The Nahuatl becomes actually a way of becoming a self-actualized human. And so that is used in a lot of different ways. And then on the inside, we have our community agreements that are also all based in indigenous concepts. So that's the framework that we came up with as a collective. The Liberated Ethnic Studies folks who wrote the original curriculum for California have some great frameworks. This is just one of them. They have some guiding principles that they call the 7 C's: cultivate, celebrate, center, critique, challenge, connect, conceptualize. If you're interested in their work, you can just Google Liberated Ethnic Studies. And one of the things that I really appreciate about them most, they're brilliant scholars, but also they're very open with all of their resources. And so they have lesson plan templates, and all of their trainings are free. And they're just, they really model, how to do this work in a way that is inviting and building solidarity with the rest of folks. And then the last one I want to share is, and I'm sharing it last because it's the most revolutionary in some ways, and the one that has the most joy and brilliance in a lot of ways. So this is the Chicano pop-up book movement. And so when the Mexican American Studies program was banned, a few days after, the Tucson Unified School District actually boxed up and banned the books that were being taught. Any books by Chicano authors, by indigenous authors, were literally boxed up in front of the students and removed from the classrooms. And so the Chicano pop-up book movement folks in LA, who have been part of this struggle well before even the Mexican American Studies program was banned, and have their own ethnic studies programs in California, they said, well, we're going to start a movement, right? It's the Chicano pop-up book movement. And they developed a curriculum for high school students mostly to research and investigate literature, social movements that are not generally covered in the traditional Eurocentric curriculum. And at the end of the unit, the students would develop a pop-up book, right? And so they have they have a manifesto, right? And they have a curriculum, and their slogan is, you can ban Chicano books, but they still pop up, right? And so they have chants and all kinds of things. And so this is another framework that is embedded in a lot of our work. We always invite Chicano pop-up book folks to present with us. And in 2018, they actually had their curriculum embedded into the Texas school state curriculum when Texas passed ethnic studies, if you can believe that in this moment today, that Texas passed any kind of ethnic studies. And so this was a post that they posted, all excited about how their curriculum was included in the state curriculum. So if you want to know more about them, they're really mostly on Facebook, and they're an incredible group of educators and organizers also on the front lines for sure. And so finally, I just want to wrap up before we take some questions, that going back to this Trenza Testimonio, this framework that I am using here, and really highlighting that each of the strands, right, of the trenza or the braid is powerful, right, and beautiful for building movements. But in order to make sustained decolonial change, we have to recognize the interconnectedness of our struggles. We have, our strength is in weaving together our movements for collective solidarity. We have to have a strong trenza. It might be a little messy, but that's okay, because trenzas are messy sometimes. But in order to move forward, as in Tiawi and Mexica Tiawi specifically, we have to weave those pieces together, and it's happening. It's happening right now amongst our movements. As you can see on the right, our last summer institute really focused on movement solidarity, and folks are really coming together. And so in this moment, as we're fighting the attacks on critical race theory, which feel very familiar, we really want to focus on the strength and the resilience and the stability of our trenzas, so to speak. So I'm gonna stop there, because that was a lot of talking. Obviously, it's a webinar, I'm talking at you, but I'm really eager to see if there are questions. And I'm not sure, Serena, if I should stop sharing my screen or.
I think sharing your screen, keeping it on there is a-okay. The less people who need to look at me when I'm speaking, the better.
Okay.
First of all, Dr. Fernandez, thank you so much. I've got so many people in the chat who are telling me to tell you that your work is amazing. They are incredibly grateful. The model, the framework model that you've developed is so relevant to the work. And there's one question from somebody. Is there a repository for digital access? Before we kind of move into the Q&A portion, I want to get that question out there for those who are going to have to leave if they're not faculty in a minute. Yeah,
There isn't one depository, but if you look up any of these organizations, either Xicanx Institute for Teaching and Organizing or Liberated Ethnic Studies, you can find resources on each one of the websites. I think that's what the question's about, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. People just looking for resources. So the first part of this was the webinar portion. We're going to move into the Q&A. Please send your questions to me via chat or DM. For those of you who are not faculty, unfortunately, this next section is faculty only. I know a few of you hear those, so I'm happy to talk with you after about anything that comes up, or you can send me your questions as well. Carla, do you want to move this from webinar into Q&A? And then folks, you can send your questions to me and I'll, get them to Professor Fernandez. And I've had several questions come in already, so we've already got a list. All right, so I know that Carla is going to take care of the math of turning this from a webinar into a Q&A. And so, sorry, just dealing with a technical issue on my end. So trying to figure out so we're going to do that. While we're waiting and while Carla takes care of turning this from a welcome into a Q&A,